Captain Sarah Chen had seen many battles in her military career, but nothing prepared her for what awaited her team in the mountains of Afghanistan. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain as her elite squad of 12 soldiers moved through the narrow valley. They were on a critical mission to secure intelligence from a suspected terrorist hideout deep in enemy territory. Sarah's team was handpicked from the best soldiers in their division. Each member brought unique skills that made them unstoppable in previous operations. There was Martinez, the explosives expert who could disarm any bomb with steady hands. Thompson was their sniper, capable of hitting targets from distances that seemed impossible. Jackson handled communications, ensuring they stayed connected with base command at all times. The team had worked together for 2 years, building trust that went beyond simple military protocol. The intelligence report suggested a small group of insurgents had been using an old compound to plan attacks on nearby villages. Local civilians had reported suspicious activity, including vehicles coming and going at odd hours. The mission seemed straightforward. Get in, gather evidence, neutralize any threats, and get out before dawn. Sarah had led similar operations dozens of times, always bringing her team home safely. As they approached the target location, Sarah noticed something felt different. The usual sounds of the mountain wildlife were absent. No birds chirped in the distance, and even the wind seemed unusually quiet. Her instincts, sharpened by years of combat experience, told her to be extra cautious. She signaled for her team to slow their advance and spread out into a wider formation. The compound sat in a natural bowl surrounded by high rocky walls. It consisted of several small buildings connected by dirt paths. From their vantage point on the ridge above, everything appeared normal. A few vehicles were parked outside the main building, and thin smoke rose from what looked like a cooking fire. Sarah studied the scene through her binoculars, looking for any signs of unusual activity or defensive positions. Her radio crackled softly as base command confirmed their position. "Eagle Team, this is Control. You are clear to proceed with the mission. Intelligence suggests minimal resistance. Estimated enemy count is 5 to 7 individuals." Sarah acknowledged the transmission and gathered her team for a final briefing before they moved down into the valley. "Remember, we go in quiet," she whispered to her soldiers. "Martinez, you take point with Thompson. Jackson, stay close to me for communications. Everyone else maintain standard formation. We secure the perimeter first, then move building by building." Her team nodded in understanding, their faces serious but confident. The descent into the valley went smoothly. Sarah's team moved like ghosts, using every piece of cover available. They had trained for situations exactly like this, where stealth and precision were more valuable than firepower. As they reached the edge of the compound, Sarah felt a familiar rush of adrenaline mixed with focused concentration. Thompson positioned himself on a small hill with a clear view of the entire area. Martinez began checking for explosive devices around the perimeter. The rest of the team prepared to enter the building systematically. Everything was going according to plan, just like their previous successful missions. But as Sarah gave the signal to begin the assault, she noticed movement in the shadows that didn't match their intelligence reports. More figures than expected were moving between the buildings. Her radio remained silent from base command, which was unusual during active operations. Something was wrong, but they were already committed to the mission. The first shots came from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah's team found themselves caught in the open, with enemy fire coming from positions that shouldn't have existed according to their briefing. It became clear within seconds that they had walked into a carefully planned trap. The enemy knew they were coming and they were ready. The ambush was perfectly executed. Enemy fighters emerged from hidden positions that intelligence had completely missed. Gunfire erupted from at least 15 different locations, creating a deadly crossfire that trapped Sarah's team in the middle of the compound. The sound of automatic weapons echoed off the rocky walls, making it impossible to determine exactly how many enemies they faced. "Take cover," Sarah shouted over the chaos, but her team was already moving. Years of training kicked in as each soldier sought the nearest protection. Martinez dove behind a stone wall while Thompson tried to find a position where he could return effective sniper fire. Jackson pressed himself against a building while frantically trying to reach base command on his radio. The enemy had chosen their ambush site brilliantly. The natural bowl shape of the valley meant Sarah's team had no high ground to retreat to. Every escape route was covered by enemy positions hidden in the rocks above. Worse yet, the compound's buildings provided excellent cover for the attackers while leaving the soldiers exposed in the open areas between structures. Sarah quickly assessed their situation. While bullets whizzed past her head, her team was pinned down with limited ammunition and no immediate backup. The nearest friendly forces were hours away, and their radio communications were being jammed by some kind of electronic interference. They were completely on their own against an enemy that clearly outnumbered them. Private Collins, one of their youngest team members, cried out as a bullet grazed his shoulder. Sarah could see him struggling to stay conscious behind a damaged vehicle. Sergeant Williams was trapped near the main building, unable to move without exposing himself to multiple firing positions. The team's medic, Rodriguez, was too far away to reach the wounded soldier safely. Thompson managed to take out 2 enemy fighters from his elevated position, but immediately drew concentrated fire that forced him to abandon his spot. "I count at least 20 hostiles," he reported through his radio before another burst of gunfire cut off his transmission. The numbers were getting worse by the minute, as more enemy reinforcements seemed to be arriving. Sarah realized that their standard tactics wouldn't work in this situation. The enemy had planned this ambush specifically to counter the methods her team typically used. Every move they made was being anticipated and countered by fighters who clearly understood military strategy. This wasn't just a group of untrained insurgents. They were facing experienced combatants who had studied their patterns. The psychological pressure was enormous. Sarah could see doubt creeping into her soldiers' faces as they realized how desperate their situation had become. Some of them were beginning to panic, making careless movements that exposed them to enemy fire. The cohesion that had made them such an effective team was starting to break down under the stress of being outgunned and surrounded. Jackson finally managed to get a weak signal through to base command, but the news wasn't good. "Control reports that reinforcements can't reach us for at least 6 hours, he shouted to Sarah between bursts of gunfire. "They're dealing with multiple incidents across the region. We're on our own until then." Enemy fighters were now moving closer to their positions, using the cover of buildings and vehicles to advance steadily. Sarah could hear them communicating with each other in multiple languages, coordinating their attack with military precision. They weren't rushing in recklessly. They were taking their time, knowing that her team's ammunition would eventually run out. The situation grew more desperate when Martinez reported that his explosives were running low. "I can maybe create one diversion, but after that we're down to small arms only," he said grimly. The team's heavy weapons specialist, Garcia, had already used most of his ammunition trying to suppress the enemy advance. Sarah looked around at her trapped soldiers and felt the weight of command pressing down on her. Every decision she made in the next few minutes would determine whether her team lived or died. The traditional military responses weren't working, and continuing to fight conventionally would only lead to their destruction. She needed to think differently, to find a solution that the enemy wouldn't expect. Sarah's mind raced as bullets continued to rain down around her team. She had always prided herself on following military doctrine and established procedures, but those methods were failing catastrophically. The enemy had studied their tactics and prepared countermeasures for everything in the standard playbook. If they were going to survive, she needed to abandon conventional thinking entirely. Looking at the compound's layout with fresh eyes, Sarah began to see possibilities that military training had taught her to ignore. The old buildings weren't just obstacles, they were potential assets. The network of underground storage areas that intelligence had dismissed as unimportant could provide hidden movement routes. Even the enemy's superior positioning might be turned against them if approached correctly. "Jackson, can you patch me through to each team member individually?" she asked her communication specialist. When he nodded, Sarah began issuing orders that went against everything she had been taught about small unit tactics. Instead of trying to fight their way out or hold defensive positions, she was going to split her already outnumbered team into even smaller groups. "Martinez, I need you to work your way toward the fuel storage area behind the main building," she said quietly into her radio. "Don't engage anyone, just get there and wait for my signal." Her explosives expert looked confused but began moving carefully through the shadows. Sarah could see him questioning the wisdom of separating their forces when they were already overwhelmed. Thompson received orders that seemed equally bizarre. "I want you to abandon your sniper position and get down to ground level. Find the old well in the center of the compound and set up there. The sniper hesitated, knowing that giving up high ground violated basic military principles. But Sarah's tone left no room for argument, and he began his dangerous descent. The rest of her team received similarly unconventional instructions. Instead of concentrating their firepower, Sarah was spreading them out across the compound in positions that seemed to offer no tactical advantage. Williams was told to move toward the enemy's strongest position, rather than away from it. Rodriguez was ordered to abandon the wounded Collins temporarily and circle around to an area where he would be completely isolated. Her soldiers followed these orders despite their obvious concerns. They trusted Sarah's leadership even when they couldn't understand her strategy. Years of successful missions had earned her their confidence, but she could see doubt in their eyes as they moved to positions that seemed to guarantee their defeat. The enemy fighters noticed the team's unusual movements and adjusted their attack accordingly. They began advancing more aggressively, assuming that the scattered soldiers were making desperate, uncoordinated escape attempts. Several enemy groups left their protected positions to pursue what they believed were fleeing Americans. Sarah watched this response carefully while making her own dangerous journey across the compound. She was moving toward what appeared to be the most suicidal position possible, directly into the center of the enemy's main firing zone. Every instinct screamed at her to find cover and return fire, but she forced herself to stick to her unconventional plan. Collins, wounded and barely conscious, didn't understand why the medic had left him. The young soldier felt abandoned as enemy fighters moved closer to his position. He could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their final assault on what they believed were desperate, disorganized opponents. The enemy commander, watching from his elevated position, felt confident that victory was imminent. The American team had broken apart and was making what appeared to be random, panicked movements. In a few more minutes, his fighters would be in position to eliminate each isolated soldier. He began planning how to use this success as propaganda for future recruitment. But Sarah wasn't panicking. She was positioning her pieces for a move that no military academy had ever taught. Her unconventional plan required perfect timing and enormous risk. If she had misjudged the situation, her entire team would be dead within minutes. The weight of 12 lives rested on decisions that went against every principle of military strategy she had ever learned. As her soldiers reached their assigned positions, Sarah prepared to either vindicate her radical thinking or watch her team be destroyed by her own unconventional choices. The next few minutes would determine whether innovation could overcome overwhelming odds, or whether abandoning proven tactics was simply a faster way to lose the battle. The moment of truth arrived as Sarah reached the center of the compound. She was now in the most exposed position possible, surrounded by enemy fighters who were closing in from all directions. Her team members, scattered across the area in seemingly random positions, waited for her signal while wondering if their captain had finally made a fatal mistake. Sarah's plan hinged on understanding something the enemy had overlooked. During her initial survey of the compound, she had noticed that the old buildings were connected by a network of underground tunnels used for storage and protection during winter months. The intelligence briefing had mentioned these tunnels but dismissed them as unimportant. Sarah realized they could be the key to turning the tables. "Martinez now," she commanded through her radio. Her explosives expert, who had reached the fuel storage area, detonated a carefully placed charge that sent flames shooting high into the air. The explosion wasn't meant to kill anyone. It was designed to create chaos and draw attention away from what was really happening. The enemy fighters immediately focused on the dramatic fire, assuming it was either an accident or a desperate diversionary tactic. Several groups abandoned their positions to investigate or respond to what they thought was a damaged fuel depot. This was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. Their disciplined formation was beginning to break apart. While the enemy was distracted by the explosion, Thompson executed his part of the plan. From his position near the old well, he wasn't trying to snipe distant targets. Instead, he was using his precision shooting skills to hit specific structural points that Sarah had identified. His bullets struck metal supports and stone joints with surgical accuracy, weakening key parts of the compound's infrastructure. Rodriguez, who had seemed to abandon the wounded Collins, was actually following a route through the underground tunnels that Sarah had mapped during their approach. He emerged behind enemy lines in a position where he could provide covering fire for the next phase of the operation. The enemy had no idea that someone was now attacking them from their supposedly secure rear area. Williams, who had been ordered to move toward the enemy's strongest position, wasn't planning a suicidal frontal assault. Instead, he was positioning himself to exploit a weakness in their defensive setup that only became apparent when viewed from an unconventional angle. The enemy fighters were so focused on protecting against standard military tactics that they had left themselves vulnerable to an approach no textbook had ever described. Sarah's radio crackled with coordinated reports from her team members. Martinez in position. Thompson ready. Rodriguez has clear sight. Lines. Each soldier had reached their assigned location and was prepared for the most unconventional assault any of them had ever attempted. The enemy commander, still confident in his victory, began issuing orders for the final phase of his attack. His fighters were moving in for what should have been easy kills against scattered, desperate opponents. He had no idea that every movement his forces made was being anticipated and countered by a strategy that existed outside traditional military thinking. Jackson, from his communications position, had been monitoring enemy radio chatter using captured equipment they had found in the compound. He reported that the enemy was calling for additional reinforcements and planning to execute captured Americans as a public demonstration. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Sarah took a deep breath and gave the signal that would either save her team or destroy them completely. "Execute Phoenix Protocol," she said quietly into her radio. There was no such thing as Phoenix Protocol in any military manual. It was her code name for a plan that she was creating in real time based on intuition, desperation, and unconventional thinking. The simultaneous execution of Sarah's plan created effects that the enemy had never anticipated. Martinez's explosions weren't random. They were carefully timed to create specific patterns of smoke and flame that obscured sight lines between enemy positions. Thompson's precision shots weren't aimed at people. They were bringing down structural elements that would channel enemy movement into predictable paths. Rodriguez's attack from behind wasn't a typical flanking maneuver. It was designed to force enemy fighters to turn around and expose themselves to the rest of Sarah's team. Williams wasn't charging into superior firepower. He was using the chaos to reach a position where he could control the entire battlefield from an unexpected angle. As the plan unfolded, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Either she was about to prove that innovative thinking could overcome impossible odds, or she was leading her entire team to destruction through reckless experimentation. The next few minutes would determine which outcome her unconventional leadership had achieved. The complete reversal of the battle situation was almost too dramatic to believe. Enemy fighters who had been confidently advancing for the kill just 30 minutes earlier were now in full retreat, abandoning weapons and equipment as they fled toward the mountain passes. Sarah's unconventional tactics had not just saved her team, they had achieved a decisive victory against overwhelming odds. Sarah surveyed the compound as the last of the enemy gunfire faded into the distance. Her team had accomplished something that would be studied in military academies for years to come. They had proven that innovative thinking and adaptive leadership could overcome superior numbers, better positioning, and careful enemy planning. The traditional rules of warfare had been rewritten in a single engagement. Thompson emerged from his position near the collapsed eastern wall, shaking his head in amazement. "Captain, in 20 years of military service, I've never seen anything like that," he said as he approached Sarah. The veteran sniper had watched the entire battle unfold from his unique vantage point and understood better than anyone how brilliant Sarah's strategy had. Ben Martinez was already examining the intelligence materials they had originally come to collect. The enemy's hasty retreat had left behind computers, documents, and communication equipment that contained information far more valuable than what they had hoped to find. "This intelligence is going to prevent attacks on dozens of villages," he reported. "We've got their entire network mapped out here." Rodriguez finished treating Colin's wound and gave a thumbs up to indicate that their youngest team member would make a full recovery. The medic had successfully used the underground tunnel system to move between positions without being detected, proving that Sarah's understanding of the compound's layout had been crucial to their success. Williams climbed down from his unconventional fighting position and joined the team as they secured the area. I had a clear view of their command structure from up there, he said. When their leader realized he couldn't counter our tactics, he just gave up trying to coordinate his forces. They fell apart because they couldn't adapt like we did. Jackson was monitoring radio frequencies to ensure that no enemy reinforcements were approaching. I'm picking up communications from their fleeing forces, he reported. They're describing our attack as some kind of supernatural event. They honestly believe we used magic or advanced technology they've never seen before. The psychological impact of their victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Enemy forces throughout the region would hear stories about an American team that could appear and disappear at will, bring down buildings with impossible precision, and turn any defensive position into a trap. Sarah's unconventional leadership had created a legend that would affect enemy morale for months to come. Sarah gathered her team for a final sweep of the compound before calling for extraction. As they moved through the area systematically, she reflected on the lessons learned from their desperate situation. Traditional military training was essential, but true leadership required the courage to abandon established doctrine when circumstances demanded. Innovation, the underground tunnel system that intelligence had dismissed as unimportant, had been the key to their survival. Sarah made detailed notes about the network for future operations. These forgotten passages might exist in other compounds throughout the region, and understanding their potential could save other teams facing similar impossible odds. Base Command finally re-established clear communications as Sarah's team prepared the landing zone for helicopter extraction. Eagle Team, this is Control. We've been monitoring your situation. Please confirm your status and casualty report. The radio operator's voice carried disbelief as he requested information about a team that should have been destroyed hours ago. Control, this is Eagle Actual, Sarah responded calmly. Mission accomplished. We have one minor casualty. Extensive intelligence materials recovered and enemy force completely neutralized. Request immediate extraction for intelligence processing. Her matter-of-fact tone contrasted sharply with the extraordinary nature of what her team had achieved. As they waited for the helicopter, Sarah's soldiers discussed the battle with a mixture of excitement and relief. Each team member had contributed to the success through their willingness to trust unconventional orders and execute them perfectly under extreme pressure. Their cohesion as a unit had been the foundation that made innovative tactics possible. The sound of approaching helicopters echoed through the valley as Sarah took one final look at the compound where her leadership had been tested like never before. She had learned that the most important quality of a leader wasn't the ability to follow established procedures. It was the courage to create new solutions when old methods failed. Her team had faced certain defeat and transformed it into complete victory through adaptive thinking and mutual trust. The experience would change how each of them approached future challenges, both in military service and in civilian life. They had proven that innovation and leadership could overcome any obstacle. 6 months after the battle that military historians would later call the impossible victory, Sarah Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the Army War College. Her presentation about unconventional leadership under extreme pressure had become legendary throughout the military community. Officers from allied nations had traveled thousands of miles to hear her explain how a surrounded, outnumbered team had achieved complete victory through innovative thinking. The intelligence gathered from that compound had prevented terrorist attacks across 3 countries and led to the dismantling of an entire network of extremist cells. The operation's success had saved hundreds of civilian lives and earned Sarah's team the highest military honors. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was the lesson learned about leadership when conventional wisdom fails. Thompson had been promoted and was now training special operations snipers in unconventional marksmanship techniques. His experience using precision shooting to modify battlefield terrain in real time had opened entirely new possibilities for military tactics. Captain Chen taught us that every rule has exceptions, he often told his students. The key is recognizing when you're facing one of those exceptional situations. Martinez was leading a new program to identify overlooked assets in combat zones. His work with underground tunnel systems and structural demolition had proven that intelligence briefings often missed critical details that could determine the outcome of operations. Enemy forces throughout the region had begun sealing their tunnel networks, specifically because of tactics he had pioneered. Rodriguez had returned to medical training with a new understanding of battlefield medicine under impossible conditions. His experience treating wounded soldiers while moving through underground passages had led to innovations in combat casualty care. Military medics around the world were now trained in techniques he had developed during those desperate minutes in the compound. Williams was working with military engineers to design training facilities that could replicate the chaos and confusion of unconventional warfare. His unique perspective on how battlefield geometry could be altered in real time was influencing the construction of more realistic training environments for future soldiers. Jackson had become a specialist in enemy communications analysis, focusing on how opposing forces react when faced with tactics they cannot understand or counter. His work intercepting enemy radio traffic during the battle had provided insights into the psychological aspects of unconventional warfare that were reshaping military doctrine. Collins, the young soldier who had been wounded during the ambush, was now a decorated veteran studying military leadership at West Point. His first-hand experience of how innovative thinking could snatch victory from certain defeat had inspired him to pursue a career developing new tactical doctrines for small unit operations. Sarah's presentation concluded with the core lesson that had emerged from their experience. True leadership requires the courage to abandon successful methods when they are no longer effective. The enemy had studied our standard operating procedures and developed countermeasures for everything we were supposed to do, she explained to her audience. Victory came from doing things we weren't supposed to do. The question and answer session that followed revealed how profoundly the story had impacted military thinking. Officers described similar situations where they had achieved success by abandoning conventional tactics. Sarah's example had given them permission to trust their instincts and innovate under pressure, rather than rigidly following established procedures. After the presentation, Sarah received a message that brought the story full circle. Intelligence analysts had identified another compound in a different region that bore striking similarities to the site of their famous battle. A new elite team was being assembled for the mission, and they had specifically requested Sarah's leadership for an operation that would require unconventional thinking. Sarah smiled as she read the mission briefing. The enemy had learned from their previous defeat and developed new tactics designed to counter the methods her team had pioneered. Traditional military responses would likely fail again, which meant another opportunity to prove that adaptive leadership could overcome any challenge. As she prepared for her next mission, Sarah reflected on how that desperate day in the Afghan mountains had changed everything. Her team had faced impossible odds and discovered that the most powerful weapon in any military arsenal was the willingness to think differently when conventional approaches failed. The legend of their victory continued to inspire soldiers around the world, but Sarah knew that each new challenge would require fresh innovation. The enemy was always adapting, which meant leaders had to be ready to abandon yesterday's successful tactics in favor of tomorrow's untested solutions. Her radio crackled with a familiar voice as her original team assembled for the new mission. Eagle Team, this is Control. You are cleared to rewrite the rules of warfare once again. Sarah grinned as she realized that their greatest victory had been proving that leadership meant never being satisfied with the way things had always been done. The helicopter lifted off toward another impossible situation, carrying a team that had learned the most important lesson of all. When facing defeat, the answer isn't to fight harder using the same old methods. It's to fight smarter using methods nobody has ever tried before.